Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show. Welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the 2024 Roland Garros championships, the French Open. And on the women's side, Iga Świątek won her 4th title, her 4th Roland Garros title, her 5th Grand Slam title overall, as she beat Jasmine Paolini in the final 6-2, 6-1. And on the men's side, Carlos Alcaraz won his 3rd Grand Slam title overall, as he beat Alexander Zverev 6-3, 2-6, 5-7, 6-1, 6-2. And there's a lot we can talk about. We can talk about different themes that emerged both in the finals, but also at different points in the tournament. I think there were both on the men's and women's sides, a lot of different storylines that we could talk about, and certainly talk about it through our own perspective, and talk about some of the themes that came up on the mental side, and bring up certain different quotes that some of the different players had, and take our own give our own sort of spin on it as it relates to the mental side of the game. But maybe we'll start with the women's side, and we can talk a little bit about Iga Świątek and just sort of her dominance. I would say sort of in the final, but really throughout the tournament. She did play a really exciting marathon match with Naomi Osaka, which we could definitely talk about a little bit. But overall, just dominant really throughout the tournament as she wins her 4th French Open. But Brian, wanted to see to get us started, wanted to see some thoughts that you had on her and on the final.
I think with Iga, it somewhat goes back to 2020, Josh, that we're seeing let me restate that a bit. In 2020, one of the things that she highlighted as being a reason for winning that tournament, sort of unexpectedly, was keeping her expectations low and her standards high. And really, what does that mean? She's really working on her process of what it means to play kind of Iga Świątek tennis. And she noted that in her press conference after the final, that it doesn't matter what the score is, she's always looking to just do her best and to continue to believe in herself and to believe in her game. And I think on clay, she's very comfortable, clearly, doing that. And so that when you do that, you're more likely to get these positive types of results. It's very difficult to obviously play matches without having the score be somewhat prominent in your mind, but that's the job of all of us as tennis players, is to try to stick to what our process is, what our best game is. The other thing I thought about this match, Josh, I mean, it started off interesting because Paolini broke right away and had a 2-0 lead, and then Iga started, I think, work her way back into the match and then kind of ran from there. But Paolini had a very interesting observation in her press conference about Iga's level of intensity, that it was at another level from what she was used to competing against. And I thought that was a great observation on Paolini's part, because we actually see this at all levels of the game. Whenever you step up a level, even if it's from a 3-5 to a 4-0 or 4-0, 4-5, 4-5, 5-0, or whatever rating system you want to use, there's generally a different level of focus and intensity at that next step. And if you don't get to that, then it's hard to maintain that. And we've seen that with lots of players, Josh. We were talking before recording. We've seen players kind of come into the top 10 for a little bit, and then they exit, and maybe they return to a set point because they perhaps can't do that. With Iga now, she's setting another level of intensity. Not that Sabalenka and Rybakina aren't there. They both had some health issues, clearly, in this. Sabalenka more clearly than Rybakina, but she's been struggling too. So I thought that intensity was really important. That Iga brings that every single match, and it's part of her process, and it's part of what she has a high standard on. And so for Paolini, who will, I believe, be entering the top 10 now, it's up to her to see if she can bring that same kind of thing, same kind of intensity. Can she train to a level where she's doing something closer and closer to what Iga's doing? Because a great tournament for her. She played some really, really adventurous, beautiful tennis, and it'd be great to see her continue that process.
Absolutely. And I think I would agree that is one of the factors that has really made Iga, so dominant these past few years and so successful. Just the intensity that she brings, she never takes a point off. And you hear her talk about it, and she's very process focused. And I think a lot of it has to do with the sports psychology work that she's done. And we've talked about this with her work with Daria Abramowitz and how, they work together in a very public way. Daria is there full time, is not only there in the box with her, but travels with her to all the tournaments. And Iga has just really seemed to embrace has embraced the mental side of the game in a more public way than anybody, but has really seemed to embody a lot of the things that we talk about, or a lot of just being process focused in this sort of a way, and it's really impressive. And I think someone like Paolini, who's making her breakthrough at the moment, has reached her first final now. Somebody like her, but also really every player, men's and women's, can really learn from that in terms of that discipline that's needed in order to be intense at that level every point. That consistency, all of that, I think, are some of the factors that have really led to Iga's success, and can certainly be things that all players can learn from and emulate.
For sure. And I think that's what we're seeing on the men's side a little bit too, is that players like Carlos Alcaraz, Jannik Sinner, they're starting to develop that quality of consistency and intensity in what they do. And it makes a difference. But that's why Djokovic, Nadal, Federer were dominant for so long, is they lived at a different level of focus and intensity than the rest of the tour. And that's always the challenge, is can you get to a place where the best in the game are, with that level of commitment, discipline, etc., to really be there. And it's a choice, and it's a hard choice. It's not necessarily easy to do. And like we were saying, earlier, some players may make, the occasional visit into the top 10, but there's a real commitment to how one has to think and be to stay there. And I think what I really liked hearing from Paolini was her awareness of that dynamic in the match as being a critical factor in what occurred.
Definitely. No, and I think, yeah, I think that shows, I think it shows sort of a respect for Iga, but it also is an awareness of what separates people, of the fact that okay, now she's finally made it to this top 10 level, but understanding that there's a whole other level in terms of Iga and what she's capable of from an intensity standpoint.
Yeah. So, any other thoughts on what you saw with the women's final? I mean, the final itself was not necessarily dramatic. It was more of a kind of a coronation of Świątek's game. She obviously did have a more exciting match against Naomi Osaka in the second round. Really, the only match in which she was that challenged. Any other thoughts on Iga's path through the tournament?
Yeah, I think the match with Osaka was very exciting, was very interesting. Brian, you mentioned this before we started recording, but um, Naomi Osaka, I think, also probably had some lower expectations on herself. Had talked about wanting to, maybe peak more so towards the hard court season, leading up to the U.S. Open, and past, and after the U.S. Open. So I think she probably had lower expectations on herself, anyways. But just yeah, really impressive how she was able to not too long after having a baby, come out and challenge the world number one on her best surface, on the surface where by far she's had the most success. So really impressive there. It'll be interesting to see what Naomi can do going forward. She also seems to have somewhat of a different perspective now. It seems to really be willing to, put in put it, she seems to really have maybe the commitment day to day. I think just some of the quotes that she's had, I think just really show a different level of maturity from the past, and maybe some of the life events that she's had has led to that as well. But yeah, I think it'll be really interesting for her going forward. I think Sabalenka, who's, obviously won the Australian Open, has been really the second best player in the past couple of years behind Iga. Um, had a tough lost to Mira Andreeva in the quarterfinals, and seemed to be struggling with I think some stomach issues. Also wasn't necessarily able to hustle for every ball. It seemed like maybe because of that, sort of a little bit hot and cold in terms of her level of intensity, probably what she was capable of with her body, which was too bad. I think certainly expect her to be really strong in Wimbledon and U.S. Open going forward. But yeah, I think the tournament was really about Iga and just how well she was able to, other than that one match, just able to sort of dismantle the field, including Coco Gauff, who, she's really had Coco's number. So yeah, beat her in the semifinals, and yeah, it was, I think going forward, I think just Coco needs to find some sort of way to break that streak, right? There's the famous quote, nobody beats Vitas Gerulaitis 17 times in a row. And maybe Coco can find that in her own head to head with Iga, and just find some way to break through that. And that's not easy. We're talking about beating the best player in the world, who's beaten you time and time again, where it's easy for that to get in both players' heads, right? That gives Iga more confidence when they play. That is certainly on Coco's mind when they play as well. But I think once you can sort of break past that, think that the dynamic can change a little bit. And they're both so young, right? I think we maybe sometimes forget that because they've both been playing at a really high level for a while, but they're both, very young. They both really have their careers in front of them. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens uh, going forward.
And I think it's a good thing for Coco to use a player like Iga as not necessarily a measuring stick, but something to pursue as a motivational factor to be better. And that's a lot of how I think top players look at each other. They don't necessarily look at each other as threats or enemies, that they're really ways of motivating myself to be better. Sinner said something like this after his loss to Alcaraz, that each time because they sort of go back and forth a little bit, and each time that one wins, it's great. They feel proud and satisfied, and then the other one is now looking for solutions to get the next one, and it's that process of back and forth. And I think we see that with players, especially at the top of the game, where the head-to-head isn't 10 wins to 0. It's maybe 7-3, 6-4, 5-5, where it's much closer, and so you can be using other players as a means of figuring out your game. What can I do to get better? What can I do to win this matchup the next time? And I think, given Coco's team, that's what they'll focus on. Whether, and that'll be her challenge to see if something like Wimbledon, Iga's not that great or hasn't been as good on grass. And I think that's something she's wanting to figure out these next couple of years. And the hard court season should be very interesting between the two of them. Before we move on to, anything about the men's game, I wanted to come back to Naomi Osaka, because I think it would be really great for women's tennis if Naomi Osaka begins to challenge for Grand Slams. She's got obviously a great game. She has won multiple Grand Slams already. And it sounds like from a mental, emotional perspective, she's in a much better place. As you said, Josh, perhaps some life events have helped with that. I think she's also somewhat of a case study in how difficult it is to be a famous person and how difficult the life is on the WTA tour and the ATP tour. That's very challenging. And we did an episode about the challenges of the tours for professional athletes. And I think Naomi, her career arc thus far has shown that that's difficult, even when you are one of the absolute best players in the world. And she said something in her press conference about, after the Świątek match, that she has this little book that she writes in, and she wrote after the match, "I'm proud of you." I think that's fantastic. And it's great that a player like Naomi has reached a point in her career where she can be really kind to herself. And I think she can be kind to herself because she went out there, she played, freely, she did what she wanted to do. She didn't have these necessarily great expectations of winning the match, but she played her game and let things play out and had a really good performance. So I think she, at this moment in time, is now proud of her journey, where she's going. And as she had said, she's really looking to peak for, September US Open timeframe. So I think that really potentially makes the US Open a very exciting tournament. If she's there, with her game and there mentally and emotionally, and then hopefully Sabalenka is feeling great. Hopefully Coco is feeling well, Rybakina and Świątek, then that makes this a very interesting event, because they all have the ability to win. They all have the ability to beat each other. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen with women's tennis over the next 3 months.
Yeah, and it absolutely, and it's often a very exciting. It's just an exciting part of the calendar, right? This time between the French Open and the U.S. Open, right, where there's three slams in right around 3 months, a little more than 3 months. And no, I agree. I think there are a lot of contenders, a lot of people. I think Rybakina and Sabalenka probably want to sort of come back and show that level that they're capable of. Obviously, with Coco winning the U.S. Open last year, she's going to want to have another really strong showing. You mentioned Osaka, and I think I think there are a lot of players. It'll be interesting, when Jessica Pegula can come back. I know she missed the French Open with an injury. So yeah, we'll definitely an interesting time for women's tennis. Obviously, there's one player at the top who's really been at the top pretty consistently. Obviously, Sabalenka, was number one for a short stint. But other than that, she's been sort of the top player. So it'll be interesting to see how some of those other players respond to that. I think also there's, a bit of a, maybe in certain ways, this French Open could even be seen as her cementing herself at that peak even a little bit more. So maybe that inspires some of these other players or motivates them to try to knock her off. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Should we transition over to the men's side and talk about some of what happened there and some of the themes that we saw?
For sure. And why don't you start us off, Josh, with your impressions of the final?
Yeah, so it was it was an amazing final. And I would say that, I think it was I think different people have probably said this, but I think it was a strange final in a lot of ways. Um, Neither player seemed to be really playing their best at the same time. Um, Alcaraz started off strong, won the first set, and then Zverev came back, won the second. And then, the third, Alcaraz was really in control ahead. And then for whatever reason, his level dropped off. And, Zverev really came storming back, won the third, was really in control of the match, 2-1 at that point. And then, and then the fourth set was Alcaraz's. And then the fifth set, there were some interesting things in the beginning of that fifth set. I know there was a line call that went against Zverev's way, but other than that, I think there were really some key differences in between them in that fifth set. And then Alcaraz, got the better of him. Whether it was Zverev maybe getting tight, maybe thinking back to maybe other matches, other Grand Slam matches that maybe haven't gone his way, and we can talk about that. But yeah, I think it was just a very interesting, weird back and forth match. And I think there's a lot to talk about there.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird match, and you would think being up 2-1 and coming back from a 5-2 deficit to win the third set would have inspired Zverev to really push through on that fourth, and it didn't seem to do that. I think Alcaraz responded well and really dominated that fourth set. And it just seemed like Zverev was a little bit of a shadow of himself. And then that continued into the fifth, and in which I was very interested in the body language of the two players in the fifth set. And from that perspective, it was clear that Alcaraz was the winner. He was the one who really wanted to take it. He seemingly wanted it more so than Zverev, where there is certainly a part of Zverev that, of course, wants to win this title, but he was almost looking for excuses for why he wasn't going to, with his body language and his gestures. And he certainly played better than he did in the US Open final in 2020, but he didn't play to the level that he'd been playing in other matches in this tournament, and he didn't play to the level throughout 5 sets that one needs to play in order to win these kind of titles consistently. So I think he's made some progress on the mental side, but you stated, Josh, that maybe he was nervous about it. I think one indication of some nerves is that in his press conference, he noted that he was tired, felt a little bit like he had no legs in the fourth set, and he also noted that he never ever feels that way. And we know that nerves tend to be like an energy drain. It's almost like if you're using your phone to watch videos all day, the battery's going to drain a lot faster than if you are not doing that. And so, nerves are like that. Nerves will drain your batteries. And so that is something I think for him to consider. He did note that they need to go back and look at that. And I think probably more on the physical training side, but he's kind of a beast in terms of his physical training and and just his conditioning. He doesn't typically get tired. He doesn't typically get cramps or anything like that. So he does need to, I think, look at that. But Alcaraz, I think, stepped up. He didn't necessarily play great either, Josh. I think in that fifth set, there were a ton of easy shots. Maybe not a ton, but a good 4 or 5 where he had wide open courts and missed. But he was winning sort of the energy, body language battle so much that those misses were not consequential.
Mm-hmm.
I think his presence was one of a champion more so than Zverev's, and that really came out in that. Even though he missed those shots, he was able to put them behind him, right? There were no gestures, what's going on, that kind of thing. Just on to the next point and continuing to break Zverev down with his game and his physicality. So I think Alcaraz was a deserving winner of the tournament. He also had a great match against Sinner, in which, again, some cramps similar to last year against Djokovic, where, I mean, it was a lot worse against Djokovic, I think, but he talked about dealing with that. And I thought it was also interesting, Josh, that he talks about how he plays in these events where he doesn't need to necessarily practice on the off day. And especially after a cramping incident, he said, his typical thing is just to walk around all day, just to keep his body moving. And one thing that I had forgotten to mention to you before we start to record that I really like about Carlos, that coming into this tournament, he noted that he's not the kind of guy who needs a ton of matches to be at his level. And that's a really great perspective, because imagine if you took the opposite perspective. Oh, I need a ton of matches to feel this way. Because a lot of players that I talk to always feel like they need to be hitting every single day or they're going to be off. The reality is you really don't. That becomes a sort of a self-limiting thing. But from a skill learning perspective, you are not going to forget how to play tennis in 1 or 2 days or even a week. But if you have that belief that you are, then that becomes a difficult thing to overcome. And so Alcaraz stating that, I think, was great. It gives him the ability to always find his best tennis within, a day or so, because he knows that he's been doing this so long. It's not gonna take him that long to find it. So that, I think, was another part of his success here, was this idea of I'll find my game. It will come. And it did. It showed up in that second week the way he wanted it to, and he was able to persevere through both of these matches in a way that he was able to play his best under the pressure. He noted that in both matches, when given opportunities to, for breaks or whatever, he took them with his game. He did not play afraid. He was decisive about what he wanted to do, and that paid off for him.
Yeah, I think you bring up some really good points. I think that, yeah, as it relates to Zverev in that match and him talking about maybe him feeling tired, and that, as you pointed out, Brian, that could be connected actually to sort of the tightness he was maybe feeling physically, or sorry, the tightness he was feeling mentally. Yeah, I think in last year's semifinal, when Alcaraz played Djokovic and really tightened up and really cramped up, that could also have been related to, to mentally, that the challenge of, facing Djokovic in a moment like that. So absolutely. And I think, yeah, from a body language standpoint, the two players were very different in that fourth and fifth set. It felt that Zverev, I understand that Zverev had a call that went against him, right? Alcaraz had a second serve that the umpire called out after looking at the mark, but Hawkeye showed that it was, I think, 2 millimeters. Sorry. The umpire called it in after looking at the mark, but Hawkeye showed it was 2 millimeters out. And I don't know. It felt, both in terms of his play, but also in terms of sort of him talking about it in his press conference, that he sort of held on to that as if that one call was the reason why he lost the match. But in reality, in a 5-set match, in a 5-set battle of twists and turns, especially when you lose the set 6-2, is it really about that one second serve call? I would say no. And I would say this to really all tennis players, adult players, junior players, pro players, non-pro players. A match is never really about one point. Yes, like I get that sometimes it feels like it comes down to one point, or one call or one shot or whatever it may be, right? Maybe it's a third set tiebreaker, or in this case, it was a key call in the fifth set. But, Zverev was also up 2-1 and then lost that fourth set 6-1, right? Zverev also was down a break when this happened in the fifth set and then proceeded to get broken again. So it's, we can look back to any one moment and sort of point our finger at it and say, oh, well, things could have been so different had that happened. And that's true, but it's, we there's no way of us knowing what would have happened. Okay, let's say Alcaraz gets broken there and it goes from 2-1 to 2-all. What if Zverev gets broken in that next game and then gives the break back, right? He had certainly hadn't been playing his best tennis for that past set or so. So who's to say he would have necessarily used that to really to capitalize on it. So I think in general, it's very easy for players to look back after losses and say, well, I lost because of that point. And maybe it's a, junior player, an adult player in a USTA tournament. And they say, you know what, my opponent made this horrible line call at this key moment. And, that type of stuff does happen. But is it really fair for us to blame the loss on that one call? I don't think so. It really doesn't feel like it is, because there are so many points in a match, and I get that some points feel bigger than others, but there are so many points in a match, we can't really say somebody won or lost based on one. And I think when it felt like Zverev holding on, like it felt that he held on to that moment a little bit too much, where that probably led to him losing that game, and then maybe that was in his head, which also led to maybe that drop in body language and drop in intensity in that fifth set, which sort of one factor leads to the next, and ultimately that's the difference maker in that fifth set.
It's a good example, Josh, that, and I totally agree with you. It's never about 1 point. And even in your post match analysis, when you make it about 1 point, that's making an excuse, because there were plenty of points to be played from that moment in the match until the end. And you have the agency to make it different. And I think, as you stated, for whatever reason, Zverev was unable to put this behind him enough to play his best, and to realize that this match is still on. Like you said, it was early in that fifth set, plenty of tennis to be played. Many players have been able to put such things behind them and come back and win. And I hope he takes a look at that, because, as you noted, he was still talking about it in the press conference. He was trying to dismiss it, I think, a little bit, but obviously
he was asked about it.
Yeah, it was still there in his head, and then he tried to dismiss it, but clearly it was something he even asked his team while he was on the court, and they had told him, I think, that Hawkeye said the serve was out. That's just part of tennis, and you have to let it go. It's part of life. Life, not fair. Tennis, not necessarily fair. And it's how you respond to these things that really matters. So hopefully a moment of growth for Zverev as he continues. But again, he has progressed from 2020 to this point in time. He's better. In theory, he should be one of the best players on the tour, with the way he is physically, his game. You could say maybe the second serve could be better, but that's a pretty nit thing, because his first serve is really good. His backhand might be one of the best backhands in tennis today, and given his height and what he's able to do with that and attack it and angle it off, really dangerous weapon. And his forehand has got some legit power to it.
And spin.
Yeah. So he's great technically on both of those things. So, I think his growth in the mental and emotional game is necessary for if he wants to continue to be in these kinds of moments going forward.
I would agree, and I expect he will. And we can even think back to his career, where he really burst onto the scene as a very young player, reaching as a top 5 player. He won multiple Masters, but also seemed to struggle in some of the Grand Slams, right? He'd won different Masters titles, and still I think hadn't reached maybe a quarterfinal of a Grand Slam. And then he reached his first quarterfinal, his first semifinal, his first final in 2020, and now his second one. So I think it's been, I think he has made a lot of progress mentally throughout his career at the Grand Slam level, but it really has felt like it's been sort of a step-by-step type of progress, where somebody like a Carlos or a Sinner, it seemed to happen more all at once, where Sinner, the second half of last year, just his ranking went up dramatically, now where he, after this tournament, will be number 1 in the world. Alcaraz certainly had quite a quick breakthrough himself. And, with Zverev, I think he has made a lot of progress mentally. at these Grand Slam events, but it's just been a slower progress. But I think, the fact that he is able to now be in a final and pushing somebody the caliber of Alcaraz to 5 sets, says a lot. And I think, yeah, I'd expect him to stick around. And I think for Alcaraz, stick around at the top of the game. And I think for Alcaraz now, he's the youngest male player to win a Grand Slam on all 3 surfaces. I think if he wins the Australian Open in any of the next 3 times, I think I saw this stat, he'll be the youngest male player to win the Grand Slam. So, really incredible what he has put together for, for such a young player, and has also seemed to turn a corner where I think the last almost year or so has, by his standard, has struggled a little bit, has been hot and cold. And I get that, that may sound ridiculous because we're talking about a player that was number 3 in the world, right? And has had some really good results still, but just the level that he showed from 2020 when he really had his breakthrough through, let's say, Cincinnati of last year was very different, where he was just, showed a certain level of consistency. And then after losing that match in Cincinnati, I know he lost I believe, to Medvedev. Yeah, he lost to Medvedev at the US Open. And then at the Australian Open, he actually lost to Zverev. And just, and outside of the Grand Slams as well, he was more hot and cold. I know he won, was it Indian Wells, I believe. But other than that, or Indian Wells or Miami, but he had just not been at his best for the last, let's say, 8 months or so. Or sorry, let's say 10 months or so. So I think this is a really important breakthrough for him as well, and I think just seemed to have a lot more discipline with his game, which I think sometimes he struggles with a little bit because he's capable of so much and can be so flashy and can just hit the most incredible highlight reel shots that sometimes he needs to rein that in a little bit and be a little bit more disciplined, which I think he found during this tournament. And he found that during the semifinal against Sinner, and then during the final, not the entire match, but enough in each match to get over the hump and to win in 5 sets. So yeah, will be very interesting going forward to see what he can do as well.
I think a good perspective that Carlos is bringing as well is he was asked a question about which of his titles he's the most proud of. Kind of went through all of them and then essentially said, I think this one, because of the journey that it took to get here. And some of that is what you're alluding to, Josh. And as well as the fact that he, sustained or had a forearm injury coming into the event. So he's wearing the sleeve on his right arm. And I think just coming through some of those hardships has made him feel proud of his journey. And if I look at some themes from the tournament overall, that's one thing I'm seeing with a lot of players is that they're proud of their journey, and then they, even if they're, say, disappointed with a result, they're focusing on the process of learning and improving and being better. They're not, I think, getting overly disappointed and holding on to losses and feeling bad about themselves. They instead they're disappointed because they would like the result to have gone their way, but they see it for what it is. And this is an opportunity to learn and grow and continue to get better. And I think we hear that from Iga, from Naomi Osaka, from Alcaraz, Sinner, for sure. Lots of players are seeing it that way. And I think part of that, Josh, is we're hearing about lots of great conversations that players are having with their coaches, that they're having with their mental performance coaches or sports psychology professionals. And I think it's just really helping to give them good perspectives on what they're experiencing out there. And that's really necessary in a difficult sport like tennis. There's so many challenges. The lifestyle is so difficult. There's so much losing that goes on just within one single match, that working on how you are processing this is very important from an emotional regulation perspective. So the more rational and more good perspectives they have, the more that they can process this in an emotionally healthy way. And that's what I'm hearing when I read or listen to these press conferences, Josh. I'm hearing lots of healthy perspectives about how to be a professional tennis player. And so I think that's a real positive for the tour. I think along with that is all these players are truly believing in themselves and believing in their games and understanding it's just a lot about going out and trying to play your best, give your best effort, and just continue to believe in yourself. Because if you're not going to believe in yourself, well, who is going to believe in you? So might as well go out there and just believe in what you're doing and give it your best, and then we move on to the next tournament. So we've talked about how tennis is a process of learning and improvement. Tournaments are just a part of that process, and you just try to build. So for me, I just love what I'm hearing, and I think the quality of coaching that a lot of these players are getting, the quality of mental performance coaching that they're getting, is really helping them navigate this very difficult professional sport.
I think that's definitely true, and I think we can see the quality of their responses, and I think their people are able to keep things in perspective a lot better, understanding that it really is a journey, understanding. And I think, honestly, and I'm just thinking of this now, but I think part of it could be the fact that players like Serena, Venus, Federer, Nadal, Djokovic have showed us that they can play so much longer. Careers don't end at 30
in
the way that they used to.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. People are playing into their mid to late 30s, even, to 40 or past 40. And it's showing, it's showing people in their 20s or let's say late 20s, early 30s that, hey, careers can be long. But so I think it helps people put things into perspective a little bit more rather than feeling like I have to win right now. If I don't win right now, it's the end of the world, which I think honestly is a perspective that all players can take away, right? Tennis really is a lifetime sport. And, if you can keep your body in a condition where you can keep playing, it really is something that you can do for as long as you possibly can. So I think for all sorts of players, being able to keep that same sort of perspective that it's not just about winning right now. It's about becoming the best player that you can be. It's about trying to do your best each day. But, ultimately, if you lose, and even if you lose in a big match, life does go on. We want to learn from it. We want to keep it in perspective, and we want to be better going forward. And I would agree with you that a lot of these top players have started to have more of that perspective. And I think it's definitely something that everybody can learn from.
And, just to sort of reinforce that, Carlos Alcaraz was interviewed by the Spanish newspaper El País. And one of the quotes that he had in there in the interview was that, sometimes it's good not to feel as if I'm just a tennis player, but to be a normal kid. And what I like about that is it's not making all this stuff life and death. I'm not determining my self-worth as a human being based on wins and losses. Tennis is something I do. It's something obviously that's very important. It's an important, meaningful project in my life. But at the same time, I'm Carlos Alcaraz, and I'm just a normal guy. I do other things. I do things with my family. I do things with my friends, whatever. And so it's not all tennis, his whole identity. And I think that's an important facet for all players, young, old, that they don't get so wrapped up in any one activity that their self-worth is defined by the results there. I like, Josh, how you're bringing up the pros, the longevity of their career is expanding. And we're also seeing some players have been better post 25 than they were before. And that's, I think when I think about players like that, I always think about Patrick Rafter doing that in the late 90s, early 2000s. But that was a really rare thing that somebody would do that. But now we're seeing it much more often. And I think that that's very cool because now it expands the window of opportunity for somebody to get great. It doesn't mean you can start playing tennis at 25 and become a professional. But if you've been working at it, we don't know when that bump may come. And as long as you're enjoying what you're doing, then why stop? And I think that's been a bit of the secret with Nadal, Djokovic, and Federer. They were clearly still enjoying what they were doing. So why stop playing when you're also playing really well? And that is a good, I think, observation that perhaps many of these players see Venus and Serena and all those others going into their 30s. Hey, this is something I could be doing for years. Let's see how good I can really get at that.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think Wawrinka would be a great example of that, certainly where he, I think was, always ranked. He was always a top player, but not a top player. And then I think, yeah, it was, same for him after that age of 25. He had sort of a later breakthrough and, really played his best tennis sort of towards the middle portion of his career rather than, let's say, bursting onto the scene in an Alcaraz type way.
And some of that tennis that he played, Josh, was legit best tennis we've ever seen, right? I mean, he dismantled Djokovic.
Yeah.
During that.
And Nadal.
Yeah. And so it's not like everybody else dropped and, now Stan stepped in there. He was amazing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on the tournament as a whole or on the men's side?
No, I thought it was very, very exciting tournament. I mean, I think we'd be remiss to not at least quickly bring up Nadal and Djokovic. Nadal having, said, so it sort of said that this may be the last year of his career. I know he hasn't said that definitively. He seemed to be asked about that in just about every press conference, but has said, he's certainly at the end of his career. And there was a lot of hype going into his match against Zverev in the first round. And Zverev, ultimately won in 3 sets, but 3 pretty close competitive sets. I think this was again only the 4th loss Nadal has ever had at the tournament after winning it 14 times. Who knows if he'll play it again, but just impressive that he was able to play at that level despite his body, the condition of his body, and despite not having a ton of matches before that. And we'll see these upcoming months what Nadal is able to do. I know Nadal and Alcaraz have talked about playing doubles potentially at the Olympics, which would be very, very interesting. Djokovic, had 2 really impressive, amazing comebacks. Coming back from 2 sets to 1 down, including a match where he was not only 2 sets to 1 down, but also down 4-2, I believe. So really impressive there. And then ultimately, suffered an injury where he had to withdraw, unfortunately, which was a shame, which is not something anyone wanted to see. We'll see what happens with him. Djokovic's ranking now drops from 1 down to 3. But I think even more importantly, now he just had surgery. We'll see when he can come back. Will probably be a couple months, it sounds like. So we'll see the level that he can come back to. It's never easy having an injury regardless, but especially, he is 37. So, certainly doesn't become any easier coming back from an injury at that age, compared to, maybe a player in their 20s. So, it'll be really interesting to see if he can, find his top form again, post injury. I would imagine he'll certainly be motivated to do so.
For sure. Yeah. So good stuff on Nadal and Djokovic, Josh, and great conversation with, respect to the tournament as a whole. So that's our show for today. Thank you all for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for the two of us, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. Also, if you are enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss on the show, please rate and review the podcast so other tennis enthusiasts can find it more easily. Additionally, to be notified of new episodes, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, and you can also check us out on Instagram. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.